For today's video, I'm going to be going over my Cold Water Walstad Method aquarium, which is just over 5 months old. This tank is currently home to my black Medaka rice fish, one of my yellow Neocaridina shrimp colonies, and a bunch of pink ram's horn snails. Now this tank has had its fair share of challenges, especially since it's running without a heater, but it's came a long way and it's safe and stable and fully stocked. But like all of my other tanks, this one has taught me a lot, so for today's video I'll be going over the setup and the first 5 months of this tank to share the lessons that I've learned from it so you can avoid the same mistakes that I made. So starting with tank setup, and I do prefer nano tanks, so I went with a 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon aquarium for this build. I did add a black background film, but in hindsight this was a mistake, but back when I set this up I wasn't sure which specific strain of Medaka I'd be putting in here because they are challenging to find, so it's basically whatever the store has is what I use. For the substrate, I started by adding around ½ inch of regular garden topsoil to serve as the base layer. I have a lot of leftover gravel from different test projects, so I decided to mix them together for this tank and use them as the capping layer. I added the Amtra sand and gravel mix first because I'm not a big fan of its colour, and then I topped the capping layer off with some JBL sand until there was a full inch of capping over the soil. The JBL sand is much finer than what I usually like to use in my Walstad tanks, but it did get the job done. That said, sand is very lightweight compared to the 2mm grain size gravel that I usually use, and it does seem to shift a lot more during water changes or any type of flow. With the substrate in place, I added a small amount of water to help release any trapped gases from the soil layer in the tank. For hardscape, I'm using a single piece of Mopani wood, and I did pre-soak this in water for a couple of weeks to try and remove as many of the tannins as possible that caused the brown tint on the water, but it really didn't make much of a difference. I really like the look of this wood, I just wish it had less tannins in it, but they are easily manageable with water changes or using something like Purigen. Moving on to planting, and this is where I did make a bit of a mistake. I usually order my plants from either Horizon Aquatics or Aquarium Gardens, and while both may cost a little bit more than other vendors here in the UK, I always get healthy plants from both of them. Unfortunately, neither of them had Hygrophila polysperma or the Rosanavig variant in stock, so I did need to use a different vendor. As you can see here, the standard Hygrophila polysperma arrived in decent condition, but the Rosanavig variant is basically melting already. In a Walstad Method tank like this one, healthy plants are crucial because they do a large part of the filtration to keep water parameters safe, and starting with melting plants like this really is not ideal. As you can see in the planting clips, the regular Hygrophila looks fine, but the Rosanavig stems are really floppy and weak and the plant is really on its way out. Still, I cracked on and I added as many stems as possible to the back of the tank to try and overcompensate for any potential lack in performance from the Hygrophila polysperma Rosanavig. Next, I added Echinodorus tropica, which has quickly become one of my favourite plants for nano tanks, and I really do love this plant. It's a dwarf sword plant that maxes out at around 10 cm or 4 inches tall, and it looks amazing with the deep green hues. I added 6 of them to the mid-ground of the tank, hoping that it would grow out and provide grazing space for my shrimp and extra surface area for my beneficial microorganisms. Finally, I added some Helenthium telenum green to the tank, and this plant always works well in my aquariums regardless of the lighting, temperature, the water parameters or even the substrate type. It's just such a solid plant. It is a stolon plant, meaning it spreads by sending out runners, but in a low-tech tank like this one it will take time to form a full carpet. At this stage of the build, all of the submerged plants were in place, and while I was still unsure about the Rosanavig variant of the Hygrophila, everything seemed to be looking good, so I filled the tank with water. I also transferred some duckweed and water lettuce from one of my other tanks to this one because they are excellent for natural water purification. To finish things off, I did add some tap water conditioner and turned on a budget-friendly light, setting it to max intensity for 6 hours per day. So moving on to cycling the tank, and this is what the tank looked like after around a week of the initial setup, and as expected at this stage, not much is happening. As I mentioned earlier, this tank doesn't run a heater because I wanted to test a few things with Cold Water Walstad setups, and the price of electricity right now is crazy, so it helps keep costs down. But it is worth noting that beneficial microorganisms and plants that are responsible for stabilising water parameters in this kind of setup grow at a far slower rate in cooler water conditions compared to heated tanks. By week 2, the plants had started to show some signs of life, but the water temperature was averaging around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit because it was the middle of winter. The soil was leaching some ammonia with levels hovering around 0.5 ppm, and nitrite had just begun to appear on my test kit, showing that the cycle was progressing through the stages. Jumping forward, and the tank had been able to hold ammonia at 0 ppm from a pretty early period, and it wasn't until week 7 that I could consistently keep nitrite levels at 0 ppm too, so I decided to add some pink ram's horn snails. The idea was that I'd add these to the tank to add a small bioload and keep the cycle going while providing nutrients from their waste for the plants until I could find some Medaka. A few days after that, I did notice a build-up of the fine particulate matter suspended in the water column, and it wasn't moving or settling, it was just hanging there. I'm really not sure what this was. It could be something released from the wood, or maybe something released from the substrate, or potentially decomposing snail waste. But with no filter in the tank and no heater running and it being the middle of winter, there wasn't even any passive water flow from temperature convection, so it was just left to sit there. So I decided to order a small nano filter for the tank. My goal was to introduce some gentle flow to the tank and provide some backup filtration to help maintain safe and stable water parameters. And if you are planning on running a Walstad Method tank in cooler water temperatures, I do recommend using a small filter just as a safety net to help keep your water parameters safe and stable during the colder months. Ironically though, by the time the filter actually arrived, the particulate matter had already cleared up on its own, so I am thinking it's some type of biological material and the waste-eating bacteria just took longer to get rid of it. So jumping forward to month 3, I'd finally managed to track down some black Medaka rice fish, which I was temporarily keeping in another aquarium. I was doing that just to see how this tank would perform because I still wasn't sure about what was happening with the Hygrophila polysperma rosanovig, and I didn't want to add fish and increase the bio load and then potentially have everything fail. But as you can see here, the ram's horn snail eggs had already hatched by this point, and even the struggling Hygrophila polysperma rosanovig was starting to look better. You can really get a sense of how many baby snails are produced in this type of tank from this clip, and keep in mind this is during the winter and breeding will speed up in the warmer months of the year. Another thing that I want to point out with this specific tank is at this stage both ammonia and nitrite, the two toxic compounds, were holding at 0 ppm. But the far less harmful nitrate was also sticking close to 0 ppm, meaning there was barely anything in there. While nitrate is technically toxic and harmful to your fish in very large quantities, my planted tanks usually sit below 20 ppm, which is well within the safe ranges. I'm guessing that the cooler water temperatures and the lack of nitrogen in the water was starting to negatively affect my plant growth. Thankfully, this is an easy fix, so I decided it was time to move my Medaka over from the holding tank into this one. Doing this will allow me to feed the Medaka and increase the bio load of the tank via their waste and leftover food, which in turn increases nitrates, giving the plants food too. Thankfully, the Medaka settled in quickly and they really are a great fit for any type of nano Walstad Method aquarium, be it heated or unheated. Anyway, around the same time as this, I was also planning to debuild one of my yellow Neocaridina shrimp tanks, so I moved some of the shrimp into this setup as well. Again, because the water parameters between the two tanks are identical, I just netted them over and dropped them in directly. I've kept shrimp, Medaka and ram's horn snails together in several tanks now, and I've never had problems with aggression or anything like that. And as you can see in this clip, everything was settling in nicely after the move, so it was time to add some food. Up until this point, I'd only been feeding the snails a quarter of a Hikari mini algae wafer every day. But with the addition of the Medaka, I also began adding some micro granules to the tank because these primarily feed the Medaka, but the snails and shrimp will also get anything that they leave. After a week of introducing the Medaka and the shrimp to the tank, my water tests were showing that ammonia and nitrite were holding at 0 ppm, but thankfully, my nitrates had increased to around 5 ppm. Not only does this prove that the tank can support the increased bioload, but it also shows that there's some nitrate available for the plants to grow. Around a week later, I noticed that one of the female shrimp were buried, carrying eggs, even though it was still winter and water temperatures were sitting at around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. So by the end of month 3, the tank was really starting to come together, and while I did notice a small amount of green hair algae forming in here, I chose to just leave it as is. It's very likely that this algae growth is just due to excess nutrients in the water column, so adding more plants to the tank or doing regular partial water changes could have been able to deal with it. So by month 4 we'd moved into the spring months and water temperatures were starting to rise, so plant growth was increasing and the Medaka was showing some breeding behaviour. I did start noticing that the 2 larger Medaka, which I now think are male, were given a lot of attention to the smaller one, which I'm pretty sure is female. To try and give her a break, I decided to net her out of this tank and move her to the Medaka grout tank that I have, which houses a bunch of young Medaka at various growth stages. Around this time I also had some Cryptococcus novellii from another tank build, so I added them to the mid-ground of this setup just to fill in the scape a little bit more. As you can see, the water parameters are still looking great, the ammonia and nitrite levels are holding at 0 ppm, and the nitrate levels had climbed up to around 10 ppm, which should be plenty of nitrogen for all of the plants. And that brings us up to the current day, and I've recently moved the female Medaka back into this tank. The problem is that in the larger tank there's a lot more Medaka in there, and the warmer weather has increased their growth rate, so the juvenile males are paying her a lot of attention as she's the only adult female. So I do think she was actually more stressed in the larger tank, so I've moved her back into this one and she does seem to be fine. She just kind of chills out in the thicker plant growth at the back of the tank. As you can see in this clip, the ram's horn snail population has really started to take over. They are devouring any food that the Medaka leave to hit the substrate, which could be causing problems with nutrients for my shrimp, but I'm not sure how to gauge that. Then there's also this ramp of sand in the front right hand side of the tank. This happened when I temporarily added another filter of the exact same model that I'm running on the tank to this one for a few days to hold the cycle while I rescaped one of my tanks. Unfortunately, I did forget to reduce the flow rate on that tank, and the higher water flow caused the lightweight sand to shift, nearly exposing the soil layer underneath. Thankfully, I did notice this very quickly, so I topped up the capping layer and turned the filter down. But as you can see, I do think I added way too much sand when I was just trying to get the job done as fast as possible to prevent any mud escaping. On the plant side of things, the regular Hygrophila polysperma has really taken off in the last couple of weeks as the water temperatures increase, and it's definitely due a trim. Unfortunately, the Echinodorus tropica did melt back significantly, and the snails quickly cleaned up the melting leaves and used them as food. Thankfully, with the rise in water temperatures now that we're in spring, you can see some new healthy growth coming through, so hopefully they will make a full recovery. On top of that, the Cryptococcus novelli that I added to the tank is also in a similar situation where some of the immersed grown leaves have melted, but there is some new healthy growth coming through. And as for the Helenthium telenum green, it really hasn't had any issues in the tank, but it also hasn't started to send out runners yet. And that brings me on to the future of this tank, and while I probably will keep it as it is for now, I am in the middle of reorganising my fish room, and I do plan to rescape this specific tank in the future. But overall, I do think this tank has been a valuable learning experience for myself and hopefully others who watch this video. My biggest takeaway is that just adding a heater from the start makes things so much easier with this type of aquarium. Another thing is that I'm probably going to try and switch back to just keeping horned neurite snails in my tanks rather than ram's horns. Neurite snail eggs don't hatch in fresh water, preventing huge population booms, which helps keep things simple, especially if you're keeping shrimp and snails together. I'm definitely more on the shrimp side of the hobby when it comes to shrimp and snails, and with the ram's horns eating so much food, it is tough to breed shrimp in this kind of setup without a filter because you can't really add more food. So moving forward, I will be focusing on no ram's horn snails. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful, and I also hope you've been able to get some lessons for your own tanks too from this video. Thanks for watching, have a good day and good luck with your Walstad Method aquariums.